Good morning. Our scripture reading today is in Luke 24, verse 13 to 32. Now that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. As they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them, but they were kept from recognizing him. He asked them, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" They stood still, their faces downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, asked him, "Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days?" "What things?" he asked. "About Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and other rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what is more, it is the third day since all this took place. In addition, some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning, but did not find his body. They came and told us that they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it, just as the woman had said, but they did not see Jesus." Verse 25, he said to them, "How foolish you are and how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory?" And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. As they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus continued as if he were going further, but they urged him strongly, "Stay with us, for it is nearly evening, the day is almost over." So he went in to stay with them. When he sat at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. Verse 32, they asked each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while we talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us?"
A podcast that I regularly listen to is titled The Daily. In The Daily, it's a 25-minute podcast where they unpack one thing that's happening in the news cycle around that week. And they do a great job of kind of giving you the background of why this event is significant and why it matters. I don't always listen to this podcast every day because it is American and no one needs to hear that much about American politics on a daily basis. But I regularly tune in because I find it fascinating. They help me understand what's happening in the world. It was around the end of last year, in December, they did a podcast entitled The Year of Taylor Swift. And they did a job of outlining her being the Times Magazine Person of the Year and how her record-breaking concert tour, the errors, and her cultural significance and her romantic life, all those things. And if you're not sure who Taylor Swift is, you can look up in the encyclopedia under S, and I think it will have something about her. But as I was reading through this, or as listening to this podcast, none of this information was particularly new or that surprising to me. However, it was near the end of the podcast that they went in a direction that I never experienced listening to this news podcast. I've spent years now listening to this podcast about them cover a wide range of topics, but this one seemed to be different. See, the New York Times columnist, a self-prescribed longtime Swiftie, she transitions from talking about Taylor's journey to fame and how she got there, and then she moves to talking about her own experience. She describes a time where she went to one of these concerts on the Eras tour. And she began to describe this moment when she was at this concert and Taylor began to play the song, "My Tears Ricochet." And she says, in that moment, this song that came alive to her, and so much emotion of her own story, it gave music to her own pain. I was taken back as I was listening to this podcast because the journalist began to speak with this deep emotion. In fact, she became emotional talking about this moment, crying on the podcast. I've never seen a journalist do this before. But she spoke with great rawness and vulnerability about her own story of pain. She described her time of insecurity and hurt and how it followed her and how that was such a painful moment in her life and how this song, My Tears Ricocheted, brought so much meaning to that. She then goes on and she describes the moment where she's in this stadium with 69,000 other people. And this song is being played and this whole stadium is singing it, an anthem, and she says, in that moment, it just came over me. The song just spoke to the deep parts of my pain. It all came over me, so much so that she calls this moment a religious experience for her. In fact, she said, in this moment, I felt like I was being saved. The best words, and seemingly the only words that could justify that deep, profound experience for her were spiritual ones. She described this moment as a religious experience, as a moment of feeling saved. See, there seems to be moments in our journey where our human experience that we experience this beauty and deep meaning. And it seems that the only way we can justify them or explain them is to describe them as spiritual. These spiritual moments, they break through the ordinary day to day and they create a level of transcendence for us. They don't just happen in places like this and mosque and other spiritual centers, but they can happen in concerts or on top of a mountain. In fact, they can happen when holding the hand of a dying relative or even laying in bed reading a book with your life partner. These experiences, as ordinary and as supernatural as sometimes they can feel spiritual. These moments of encounters that are beyond yourself. They engage with our emotions in profound ways, and many describe these moments of sheer joy and peace. And the reality is, research continues to show over and over again that the vast majority of the population would say they have moments just like this. Moments that the only way they could describe them is spiritual. Mark Lilia, the Columbia professor, says it best. He says, to most humans, curiosity about higher things comes naturally. It's indifference to them that must be learned. So, today, on Easter Sunday, we're looking at this little story, the story that you just heard read to you about these two disciples that are journeying to a place called Emmaus. It's just right after Jesus' resurrection. And today, I want to make the case that this ancient story that we're going to look at is actually the story of life. I think this story actually illustrates what happens for many of us when these common phenomenons, these moments of transcendence happen. I believe they're just little moments, little glimpses of the presence of somebody or someone who has always been walking alongside you. David Brooks says, human life points beyond itself. And as outlandish as it all sounds, I believe this story illustrates how we, like those first disciples, can miss Jesus walking alongside us. And rather, these moments of transcendence are pointing us to something that's happening all around us. So my hope today is as we move through this little story, we'll see three themes that emerge to help us see Jesus walking alongside us, see his presence. Those three themes are barriers to Jesus, making sense of Jesus, then finally experiencing Jesus. So we're going to take them one at a time as we unpack this story. Firstly, barriers to Jesus. Some context for you if you are new to the story of Jesus. This little story it's called the Road to Emmaus is nestled between Jesus' resurrection, the empty tomb, and Jesus appearing before the apostles, his kind of inner crew of folks. This story is only found in one of the biographical sketches of Jesus, and it's called in the book of Luke. Most of what we know about Jesus is found in four independent biographies of his life: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They're found at the beginning of your New Testament. But Luke is the only one that tells us about this story around Emmaus. It's about these two disciples that on Sunday, remember, crucifixion of Jesus happened on Friday, and it's Sunday now, and they're walking to a place called Emmaus from Jerusalem. It's about a 2.5-hour journey. And they are downcast. They're feeling discouraged and confused about everything that's happened in the last 48 hours, and they're trying to make sense of all of it. And as they're walking, these two disciples, Jesus comes alongside them and walks with them. And then verse 16 says this of chapter 24, but they were kept from recognizing him. Now, scholars and commentators, they debate about what's actually happening here. Jesus is walking with them, but they don't realize it's Jesus. Different ideas of what's going on. Some scholars say that there's sort of this divine blindness that's put over these two disciples, that God's prohibiting them from seeing them. But Jesus does seem to be somewhat in human form, because they don't think much of this presence of this guest that's joining them on this journey. Other people think, well, maybe Jesus was kind of had a toque on and changed a fake mustache or something like that, just incognito. We don't really actually know what's happening here and why they did not recognize Jesus. But regardless of what's going on in this story, isn't this the reality of life? Isn't this often how life is? Don't we seem to miss Jesus even when he's right there in front of us? Isn't there many factors in our lives that always get in the way, that blur Jesus or keep Jesus maybe, we don't see him in his fullness? Or to say it another way, what are the barriers today that cause us to miss Jesus? I think there's many barriers for us to miss Jesus amongst us, but I want to suggest two primary ones that I think are specific to our time today. The first one is what I would call a distracted life. You ask anyone, almost anyone, hey, how are you doing? How's life? And almost the initial response, anyone would say, life is busy. Busy seems to be the theme of the modern North American life. We all are busy. Doesn't matter what stage or what age or what's going on. There's always something that's keeping us busy. And for some of us, that's a badge we wear. And for others, that's a reality that we're always trying to escape, but we always seem to get back into. And although we continue to tout of all these inventions that should make our life more easier and seamless, somehow we don't seem to be able to slow down or have any more free time. Of course, technology has played significantly in this. Those little computers called smartphones that live in your pockets day in and day out, they have changed the world that we now know. We do not know what it's like to be bored. I remember being bored. It happened decades ago, but I remember that moment. But we don't know. We don't know what being bored looks like. We don't know how to quiet our mind. We don't know how to not distract ourselves with a podcast or a show or streaming this or sliding for that or this or that. And all these things are around us, and we don't know how to quiet our mind and, more importantly, our soul. But the amazing thing is that most people who would describe having these spiritual moments, well, they usually happen when they leave the busyness of life. And the busyness of life seems to settle, and they're able to escape from the world and even the worlds of their phone. Even personally speaking, some of the most profound moments I've seen Jesus in my life have not been in places like this, have not been in small little groups of people huddled together, haven't been in prayer meetings, but they've actually been in remote places, secluded places where I've been all alone, where I've had no technology, I've had no internet, no data, no cell service. It's in those moments that I seem to see Jesus most clearly. Could it be that Jesus has always been walking with you, but you failed to see him because you've never stopped to see where he might be showing up? The second barrier that I think is common for many of us today is what I would call your constructed image. These two disciples, as they were journeying, they were discussing and they were trying to make sense of what happened. And they had so many challenges of the events that played out, specifically the crucifixion. These disciples couldn't make sense of the crucifixion because they saw that the Messiah that was prophesied was not one that could suffer. In fact, Jesus in this text rebukes them for their not being able to see the connection through what the Hebrew Scriptures prophesied and what Jesus of Nazareth did on the cross. But for one reason or another, their constructed image of Jesus didn't fit into it. What they thought the Messiah would look like, Jesus didn't quite fit into it. Scott McKnight is a Bible scholar, and he teaches at a university. And one of his classes, at the beginning of it, every class, at the beginning of the semester, he gives out a little exercise, a quiz. He hands it out to everyone, and the first quiz, they have to answer questions of who they think Jesus is like. So the questions like, does his mood often go up and down? Is he talkative? Is he rather lively? Questions like that. It's about a couple pages. They fill that out. Then as soon as they're done that, he takes it from them and he gives them another quiz. This quiz is asking, who are you like? Same questions, though, but asking about yourself. And then they finish that exercise. And he says, after doing this over years and years, there's something that seems to come up over and over again. It's shocking how strikingly similar these two analyses are. He says, isn't it interesting that the Jesus we view neatly fits into our own view of the world? In other words, how they responded to what they think Jesus is like is very similar to how they think what they think themselves are like as well. They almost always mesh in together. Our view of Jesus often fits into our own view of the world. See, we all make a construct of who Jesus is to some extent. But if Jesus is a real historical person, if we're going to see him in our midst, then we need to see Jesus as who he actually is. See, many in our society today wouldn't say they follow Jesus, and for the most part, they have adopted assumptions of who they think Jesus is. And it's funny, when I talk to people, a lot of people see Jesus as this sort of legalistic conservative guy. Or maybe there's others who have followed Jesus for a while, then after following Jesus for a season, there's aspects of Jesus that they come across that they just don't really like. They just don't like those aspects of Jesus, so they deconstruct Jesus and then they reconstruct Jesus back together that look strikingly similar to their own values, which are based on the cultural moment that they live. And in doing so, they're making Jesus nothing more than a spiritual hype guru man. Maybe, just maybe, we miss Jesus because we expect him to be a certain way. We expect him to fit in our own construct of who we think he should be. I say all these things to demonstrate that there are barriers for us to miss Jesus amongst us. We, like those original disciples, miss Jesus although he is walking right alongside us. But the story goes on from there and moves to a different theme, and that's what I would title Making Sense of Jesus. Now, for some of you, and actually many probably in our city, this is all a little too much. This whole Easter narrative, the songs we're singing about, the stories we're sharing, some God who was man and he rose from the grave, and it just all sounds a little bit crazy if we're honest. And now, I'm telling you about Jesus is somehow walking alongside you in some mystical and supernatural way, and you're just missing him. As if you just need to believe strong enough or do the right things and you'll see him. See, this all sounds a bit too much for many of us. It's sort of this spiritual escapism, right? Meaning a spirituality that escapes from the reality of the physical world and actually learn how the world works. But this is not what the story is suggesting. In fact, the writer, Luke here, describes the disciples as talking and discussing. That's what it says in your English translation. But in the original language, it connotes a lively discussion. In other words, they were evaluating all they saw and heard. They were evaluating the evidence. They were debating. They were trying to make sense of it all. And even in this story, this little story, we see the disciples going through the evidence, evaluating what has happened. They actually outline a few things that are significant for us. The first one is that Jesus existed in history. Unlike many other spiritual texts that you'd find in many of the major religions, Christianity is unique, and the story of Jesus is unique because it actually exists in history. It's just not some kind of vision that someone had or some prophet and they wrote about it, but it's about a historical realities, events. These places and people are real things. And no serious scholar or historian would tell you that Jesus did not exist. It's actually unanimous within the scholarly world that Jesus was a historical person that lived in the first century, that died by crucifixion of the Romans. No one debates that. And that's what the disciples are saying here. But it's also interesting, they talked about how Jesus was foretold. Even Jesus makes this connection for us. It's interesting that Jesus in his life actually fulfilled 300 prophecies that were written about him centuries before he even walked the earth. Over 300 of these prophecies Jesus fulfilled, which is actually kind of complicated because some of those prophecies happened out of his control about how he would die and things around that. But Jesus seems to fulfill all those things that come together. Then finally, the church took off. You hear the disciples kind of making sense of this empty tomb, and at first they're like, this sounds a little bit too much. This doesn't really make sense for how we know how death works up to this point. But this is the problem for historians and sociologists. In fact, this has become repeatedly a problem, and there's books and articles, and people debate, and they cannot make sense of why the church took off. The church as we know it should not exist. Everything was out against it. There's no reason for the church and the early disciples to continue on with this myth or this idea of Jesus. And actually, some of the best historians and sociologists come to the conclusion that the most logical response is that Jesus actually rose from the grave. See, the disciples are wrestling with these things. They're evaluating them. They're having conversation around this. And all of this addresses what I would say one of the biggest misconceptions of Christianity. And that is, many believe that Christianity is somehow this blind leap of faith. That people who follow Jesus are just simple people who do not want to address the reality of science and hard truth. That what we're doing here in spaces like this is this form of escapism. That we don't actually want to face the facts or face reality, and we're just holding on to these primitive ideas of this guy who rose from the grave. But faith in Jesus, well, it's the furthest thing from this caricature. It's faith with good reason. Jack Lewis, more commonly known as C.S. Lewis, was the writer of the popular children's series Chronicles of Narnia, and he lived in the 20th century, and he grew up in a place called Ireland, where he was baptized in the Church of Ireland. And this was his family heritage, but over time, through his adolescence, he drifted away from this early aspect of his family's faith. In fact, so much so that Lewis later in life became the staunch atheist and objected as any opportunity he could against Christianity. In fact, in an early letter from his life, he wrote to a friend saying this, "I believe in no religion. There is absolutely no proof for any of them. And from a philosophical standpoint, Christianity is not even the best." However, as Lewis' life continued, he arrived at Oxford, and while at Oxford, he met some other brilliant, intelligent students. And as he befriended these students, it became confounding to him to learn that these students were also Christians. See, up to that point, Lewis thought intelligence and faith could not coexist. And so as he continued his studies, he continually was surprised that some of the most persuasive writers with the most powerful arguments were Christians. In fact, later on in life, he says, while it was at Oxford that he realized some of the smartest intellectuals around were what he described as supernaturalists. And it was him wrestling with others and having conversation and looking at it from different angles of philosophical and theological and the different aspects of this. After deep, thoughtful examination of the evidence, Lewis in time came to Christ. As one observer of his life comments at the time that he is the most reluctant convert in England. Lewis then goes on to become one of the greatest thinkers of the 20th century for Christianity. And that only happened by him thinking deeply about how Jesus has always been the answer to his questions, how Jesus has always just been walking alongside of him and missed it. Lewis goes on in one of his books and he says this: God is no fonder of intellectual slackers than of any other slackers. If you are thinking of becoming a Christian, I warn you, you are embarking on something which is going to take the whole of you, brains and all. Therefore, you and I, we do not just base our experience of Jesus on feelings or some spiritual escapism. Rather, it is with long and deep and thoughtful approach that many of us recognize and see Jesus on our spiritual journeys. It's not abandoning our minds, it's rather digging deeper where many of us find him. And this leads us to the final part of this story, which I titled Experiencing Jesus. The disciples then arrive at Emmaus, where they were destined to go, and as they're there, Jesus is drifting off as he's going to go a different direction, but they encourage him to come and have a meal with him. This whole time, this whole 2.5-hour journey, as Jesus is explaining all these different realities to them, as they're discussing, debating, this whole time, they never saw Jesus until they stopped and had a meal with him. That's significant. See, in the ancient world, having a meal was something that was extremely vulnerable. It was intimate. It was slow. See, a meal in the ancient culture had much prominence, more prominence than it does today. Sure, we connect over meals, and if you're going to have somebody over, you usually have a meal for them, or sometimes a first date involves a meal, and all those meals still have a significant part in our culture. But many of the meals that we have are just purely out of nourishment. We're just going to get what we need so we can continue on to what's more significant. But that's not how meals were in the ancient world. Meals were the place of prominence. It's what the whole day was building to. And the ancient world saw the meal as a pivotal moment. See, the meal was something that you would actually spend a long period of time with other people. You often would recline on these pillows around, and you would eat food and have discussion. And maybe even more importantly, the meal where statuses were affirmed or denied. That's when you actually read Jesus' biography, you see all the time there's discussion and debate about where people are going to sit at the dinner table, because where you sat actually was significant and mattered. And even more than that, Jesus gets in trouble all the time with the religious elite and the establishment because he always has a meal with the people he's not supposed to eat with. And again, we see that today of politicians all the time doing things like that, sitting down to show that they're one of the people. But in the ancient world, who you ate with actually demonstrated a lot of significance. And so Jesus here sharing the meal with these disciples is one of the most intimate things he could do with them. By him sitting down and eating with them is a communication of acceptance and intimacy. And in the same way, Jesus is inviting us to commune with him. He has laid a table out for us, and he invites us to take a seat. Many individuals who are followers of Jesus don't just follow Jesus because he makes rational sense, but because they've had experiences with him. In fact, you might today remove some of the barriers and even make sense of some of the evidence, but it's discovering Jesus on your journey is not simply believing a set of beliefs or committing intellectually in who Jesus is. It's about communing with him. It's about sitting down at the table with him. It's about having a meal together. Jesus invites you to the table that he has set out for you. For many, their commitment to Jesus is based on this reality of experiencing him. But the reality is, many individuals who are followers of Jesus are hesitant to describe their spiritual experiences. Because as they do, they're worried their friends and families might think we're going off the rails. Oh, here they go again. He's mentioning that Jesus person, and people assume that you're one of those, right? Or some other thing, as they might think that when you say, I believe in Jesus, they just might hear you saying you believe in the Loch Ness Monster. It's just as crazy or an outlandish of an idea for them. But yet those who have followed Jesus for a journey would describe having these profound moments that might be simple, but yet they are reassuring about their faith and their confidence in the presence of Jesus walking alongside them. See, we have these experiences, be that as it may, but we have challenges articulating these experiences. The interesting thing is, if you ever sat down with someone who would say they follow Jesus and you asked them about experiences they would have with him, they would say things like, I kind of have this feeling, or I had this presence that felt like peace or love. But they often would say things like, I just don't have words to describe it. I kind of knew. Where I live, every morning, I go for a walk with my dog. And where I live, there's a mountain range just down in the valley. I can see Mount Baker. And so I usually try to time my walks in the morning when the sun is coming up. Sunrises are beautiful. Some of you don't know they exist. They do. They happen early in the morning. But I found when we moved here and I started to go on these walks, I'd go up this little path that's kind of under these electrical lines. So there's no one really around, and you'd have this beautiful picture of the valley, and you'd see Mount Baker and the mountain ridge, and the sun is just coming up, and it's just vivid with color. And every sunrise is different. And the Mount Baker, as it sits there, the peaks of it, and just white, and the sun shining on it, and I just feel so surrounded in that moment with this beauty of what's happening. So because I'm a millennial, I inevitably pull out my smartphone and I try to capture this and change the filters and the angles. I zoom in, that's terrible. I zoom out, that you can't see everything, and I just try to capture it because it's just so stunning. I'm just caught up in the wonder and the awe of that moment. I want to share it with somebody. But what I've learned after doing this several times when I get back to my house and Amy's just climbing out of bed, and I'm like, Amy, look at this. And on my little smart technology phone, I show her this picture. And like her children, she pats me in the head and she's like, that's nice, dear. Try to remove your thumb next time when you take that photo. The photo never gives it justice. The photo doesn't show the vividness of color that your eyes see. The photo is just kind of one shot, but doesn't get the whole narrative, the whole picture. The photo doesn't show how surrounded you feel in that moment, in that space. It's the wonder and the awe and the transcendence is removed from it, isn't it? I feel like that's often what it's like to describe Jesus to people. It's just like something you got to experience on your own. See, the invitation of this story, of this ancient story of these two disciples that were on a journey to Emmaus, is an invitation to experience Jesus afresh. And for some, it's profound, it's supernatural, and others, it's just simple. It just feels like an assurance, like a confidence that's just deep in your spirit. There's no one size fits all, but these moments of transcendence are glimpses. There are moments of someone's presence who is walking alongside with you. If you're comfortable, I invite you this morning just to close your eyes. And the only reason I ask you to do that is just to give some space to what's happening in the room and just allow to position your heart and your spirit to receive what Jesus has for you. And with your eyes closed, I just have a few questions for you. As we look through the story of Emmaus and as we think through this reality, where has Jesus been on your journey? Where has he been that you potentially have missed him? Where might he be showing up for you? Just take a moment to take an inventory of your life And maybe, just maybe, there's the presence of someone who's been walking alongside you every step of the way. Whether you felt it or not, his presence has always been there. So there's a few invitations for you today on this Easter Sunday. For some of you, it's to invite Jesus into your life. Maybe Jesus has been a foreign concept for you. Maybe Jesus was something that you knew about as a kid or years ago, but something you've drifted from. Maybe you've been on your own journey, your spiritual journey for a long time, and you've been just trying to make sense and look through the different realities of how life works, but there is the one. There's a person who's been with you every step of the way. His name's Jesus. And so today there's an invitation to receive him, to invite him into your life. It doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't have to be this whole procedural thing. But it's just a gentle commitment to see Jesus amongst you. Maybe for some of you, there's the reality that there's been barriers in your life. Your life has been quite distracted. You've constructed it of an image of Jesus that is more based on your preferences than who he actually is. There's barriers. There's things that are getting in the way that makes Jesus fuzzy or feel distant from you. Maybe there's a moment to repent of those things, meaning to turn from those things and to settle those things and remove all the obstacles and all the barriers that make Jesus' presence to you more visible. And finally, I think there's an invitation for all of us in this space, in this room, to come back to Jesus and experience him again. The Easter story is the story of the great Messiah coming and setting a table for us to commune, to feast, to spend time with him. There's an invitation to experience Jesus once again on this Easter Sunday. Maybe Jesus has felt far. Maybe you've been unsure of even his presence. There's an opportunity to receive today. There's an opportunity to position your heart and your soul and your mind to be open to experiencing him once again. So, Heavenly Father, we are so thankful for your Son. So Jesus, would you just become so present in this space? Jesus, we just pray that any barriers that would get in the way, any obstacles, Lord, we remove those. And Jesus, would you just be so clear today? Would this day, March 31st, 2024, would it be a day where people draw a circle around that date, say they experience something beyond themselves? Lord, may we receive what you would have for us. In your beautiful name. Amen. Amen. I'm going to invite you to stand this morning. The prayer team is coming. They're going to be at the front here. Every Sunday we give an opportunity for you to be prayed for. So maybe you're walking in here. Maybe you're walking here with something that's not even related to what we were talking about today, but you want someone to intercede, to pray on your behalf. Our prayer team is here. They would love to pray with you. But we got one more song we're going to sing together. We just want to give some space for the Spirit to speak to us. And so let's sing together.